Today, we're digging into one of the most misunderstood conflicts in all of history, the Crusades. For almost 200 years, this was way more than just a holy war. It was a global game changer that kicked off with a single fiery speech, but ended up completely reshaping the world in ways that, trust me, nobody saw coming. Right? A 200-year war. Just think about that. What could possibly fuel 2 straight centuries of conflict between the East and the West? Well, the answer isn't simple, and it is so much more fascinating than just a story about religion. So where does it all begin? The year is 1095, at a meeting in Clermont, France. And it's here that one man gives a sermon so incredibly powerful that it literally lights a fire across an entire continent and sets this massive, century-spanning conflict into motion. To really get this, you have to understand the situation. The Byzantine Empire, which was kind of the shield of Eastern Christianity, was starting to crumble after a huge military defeat. So the emperor, Alexios, sends this desperate call for help to the West. And Pope Urban II, he sees this as more than just a crisis. He sees a massive opportunity, a chance to help out fellow Christians, sure, but also to really flex his papal authority. And, this is the big one, to reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem. And this was the Pope's masterstroke. I mean, what an offer. He promises the ultimate spiritual reward. A get-out-of-jail-free card for your soul, a direct ticket to heaven. For everyone, the super devout, the sinner, even the adventurer, this promise was basically irresistible. But you have to ask yourself, was faith the only thing driving tens of thousands of people to march across the entire known world? So this is where it gets really interesting, because when you start to peel back all those layers of religious passion, you find what can only be described as a perfect storm of very, very earthly problems just boiling over back in Europe. And suddenly, the Crusades start to look like the perfect solution. Think of it like this, like a row of dominoes just waiting to fall. Europe was a mess. It was struggling with overpopulation, famine, and you had this whole class of knights with no land and a lot of pent-up aggression who were just fighting each other all the time. So the Pope, brilliantly, channels all of that destructive energy and points it outward. He's using faith to solve Europe's real-world problems, while at the same time, merchants in Italy are seeing a golden opportunity to get their hands on those incredibly rich Eastern trade routes. So here's the bottom line. For every single person who is marching for God, you can bet there was someone else marching for gold, for land, or for pure political power. The Crusades were this incredibly complex cocktail of faith and ambition. It was a holy mission that also just happened to promise a very, very earthly prize. All right, so let's jump into the campaigns themselves, because what happened on the ground was often chaotic, unbelievably brutal, and went completely off script from the original plan. Now, the First Crusade, against all odds, was a shocking success. I mean, they actually did it. They captured Jerusalem. But their victory wasn't just about their own military might. Nope. They were basically walking into a Middle East that was deeply divided against itself. The rivalry between the Sunni Seljuks and the Shia Fatimids in Egypt created this huge power vacuum, and the Crusaders just walked right in and exploited it to set up their own little kingdoms. Okay, now let's fast forward about 100 years to 1202. The Fourth Crusade gets underway. The goal is the same old story: retake Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The plan is set, the armies are ready to go. But they never even got close. In what has to be one of history's most cynical plot twists, the Crusaders ended up owing a ton of money to Venetian merchants. So, to pay off their debts, they attacked not Jerusalem, but the incredibly wealthy Christian city of Constantinople, the very city they were supposed to be helping in the first place. They sacked it without mercy. It's just a stunning example of how far the motives had drifted from that original holy cause. One of the most haunting stories from this whole era is the so-called Children's Crusade of 1212. It's this legend of innocent kids marching off to the Holy Land. But the real story is so much more complicated and, honestly, even more tragic. Yeah, so modern historians are pretty sure this wasn't an actual army of children. It was more likely 2 totally separate movements of what they called the pueri. Now, that's a Latin word that can mean boys, but it was also a term for the wandering, landless poor. These weren't armies, they were desperate groups of people from the absolute bottom of society, hoping for some kind of miracle. And their journey just ended in total disaster. Thousands died of starvation or were captured and sold into slavery. So, you look back at 2 centuries of fighting, 4 major crusades, countless smaller ones, And they failed. They failed at their main goal. The Holy Land was still under Muslim control. So was it all for nothing? Well, here's the great paradox. The complete military failure in the East accidentally sparked a massive, massive success in the West. The old feudal system, it was shaken to its very foundations. So many lords and knights went off to fight and just never came back. A lot of them had to sell their land to the king or to bankers just to pay for the trip. And all of this helped consolidate power into the hands of central kings, which eventually paved the way for the modern countries we know today. And the Crusaders didn't just bring back souvenirs. They brought back a full-blown revolution. They came home with new goods like spices, silk, and sugar. They brought back new financial ideas like banking. But most importantly, they brought back lost knowledge, the incredible works of the ancient Greeks on math, medicine, and philosophy, all of which had been saved and even improved upon by Islamic scholars, came flooding back into Europe. And that knowledge, it lit the fuse for the intellectual explosion that we now call the Renaissance. So at the end of the day, we're left with this incredible thought, a series of holy wars born from both faith and greed that completely missed their target. But in doing so, they inadvertently kicked Europe out of the Middle Ages and into the modern world. It just goes to show you that sometimes the biggest consequences in history are the ones nobody ever intended.